To really understand the Congo, it helps to see it through the lens of its history. One pivotal event that shaped modern Congo was the creation of the Congo Free State in the late 19th century. This so-called charitable colony was established by King Leopold II of Belgium. Officially, it was presented as a humanitarian effort, but the reality was far more sinister. It turned into a brutal regime responsible for the deaths of around 10 million people. But why the Congo? How did things escalate to such horrifying levels? Why did Leopold's rule go unchecked? And why couldn't the Congolese defend themselves? To make sense of these questions, it's essential to look at the events that came before and after this dark chapter. The Congo's history is rich and varied, with a landscape inhabited by diverse cultures, political systems, and economies. These ranged from large, state-like kingdoms to small nomadic communities. But the arrival of the Portuguese, armed with guns, and later Leopold's ruthless militia, the Force Publique, drastically disrupted these societies. Archaeological evidence shows that the Congo Basin supported thriving communities long before Europeans arrived in the late 15th century. These societies were deeply connected to the land, using its abundant natural resources to sustain themselves. For instance, the 1988 discovery of the Semliki harpoon in Katanga reveals advanced fishing techniques from over 90,000 years ago. This barbed harpoon was likely used to catch massive river catfish, showcasing the ingenuity of early inhabitants. The region saw significant change when Bantu peoples began migrating into Central Africa around the first millennium BC. Over time, they expanded southward, adopting practices like pastoralism and Iron Age technologies. These advancements had a profound impact, particularly on agriculture and animal husbandry. In contrast, the hunter-gatherer groups in the south and southwest relied on more basic metal tools. As the Bantu expanded further east and southeast, these hunter-gatherer societies were gradually displaced. By the 10th century, the Bantu had solidified their presence across West Central Africa. Growing populations gave rise to complex trade networks, connecting local, regional, and even foreign markets. These networks were built around resources like salt, iron, and copper, creating a robust economy long before colonial interference. The Congo River and its network of tributaries have always been central to life in the region, shaping the way people live and interact with their environment. These rivers are a lifeline, providing water and food, as well as forming a natural trade network that has supported regional commerce for centuries. They've allowed people to connect with distant communities and transport goods across vast areas with remarkable efficiency. The Congo's climate, however, plays an equally significant role in defining the region's challenges and opportunities. Much of the area is covered by dense tropical rainforest, which experiences some of the heaviest rainfall on Earth. While this might seem like a boon for agriculture, the reality is quite different. The constant rains saturate the soil, making it waterlogged and prone to flooding. As a result, the land struggles to support large-scale farming, which in turn limits the capacity to sustain a large population. This is why the Congo not only has a relatively low population, but also one of the lowest population densities in the world. Another key aspect of life in the Congo is the prevalence of hunter-gatherer groups, including the pygmy population. Their way of life isn't just a cultural tradition, it's also a practical response to the region's geography and climate. With agriculture limited by the challenges of the rainforest environment, hunting and gathering remain a more reliable and sustainable means of survival for many communities. This lifestyle has allowed these groups to adapt and thrive in a region where large-scale farming is often not feasible. By the 13th century, the Western Congo Basin was home to three major confederations of states, each with its own unique character and influence. In the east, the most powerful and ancient among them were the seven kingdoms of Congo, Dia and Laza. South of this region lay Mpemba, a significant confederation stretching from what is now Angola all the way to the Congo River. Across the Congo River to the west was a smaller alliance of three states, Vungu, Kakongo, and Goyo. The dominant political entity in the region, both before and during the early encounters with Europeans, was the Kingdom of Congo. This powerful state was located primarily in the southwestern part of the modern Congo, but its reach extended into parts of northern Angola and Cabinda as well. At its peak, the kingdom stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Congo River in the east, and from Point Noir in the north to the Loge River in the south. The Kingdom of Congo was established in the 14th century and quickly became the central power in the region. By the 16th century, it was said that the smaller kingdoms that had once been independent were now unified under the authority of the King of Congo. This growing centralization meant that while these provinces retained symbolic importance, their actual influence diminished over time. Leadership within the kingdom was highly organized, with governorships often granted to members of the royal or noble families. These governors, appointed by the king for set terms, had the authority to choose local officials, creating a hierarchical structure that extended down to the village level, where leaders were selected locally. As the Kingdom of Congo consolidated its power, this system ensured strong control over its provinces, although it came at the cost of diminishing the autonomy of its allies. The early expansion campaigns of the Kingdom of Congo brought many new territories and populations under its control. Starting in the 14th century and peaking in the 17th, the kings of Congo actively relocated war captives to the royal capital of Mbanza, Congo. This forced migration concentrated a significant population in and around the capital, playing a pivotal role in centralizing the kingdom. Portuguese visitors in the late 15th century described Mbanza, Congo as a sizable city, comparable to the Portuguese town of Évora in 1491. By the end of the 16th century, the core region of the kingdom spanned approximately 130,000 square kilometers, with a population likely exceeding 500,000. This dense population, combined with the economic activities centered around Mbanza, Congo, reinforced the power of the Congolese monarchy. A centralized government emerged, with enslaved captives integrated into society, contributing to a surplus in food and labor. Meanwhile, rural areas supported the capital through taxes, providing goods that Mbanza, Congo could not produce on its own. This economic and political system solidified the kingdom's structure and power. When the Europeans first made contact with the Kingdom of Congo, they found it to be the hub of an extensive trading network. Beyond its abundant natural resources like ivory, the kingdom was known for its skilled craftsmanship and trade in copperware, iron goods, raffia cloth, and pottery. The Congo people, who spoke the Kikongo language, demonstrated a well-developed society with a strong economic base that allowed the kingdom to thrive as a central force in the region. Portuguese explorers first arrived in the Kingdom of Congo in 1482, forming an alliance that profoundly influenced the kingdom's trajectory. This partnership led to the conversion of many Congolese royal families to Christianity, sparking a wave of cultural and political change. Armed with Portuguese support, the Congolese engaged in wars against neighboring tribes, capturing their people and trading them to the Portuguese as enslaved labor. However, the rapid spread of Christianity was not without resistance. Many Congolese opposed these changes, resulting in internal conflicts. While the Christianized chiefs eventually emerged victorious, the kingdom retained a blend of its traditional beliefs alongside the newly introduced Christian values. This alliance with Portugal was fraught with contradictions. While the two powers cooperated, the Portuguese, joined later by the British, Dutch, and French, enslaved many freeborn Congolese, often bypassing the authority of Congolese leaders. Europeans viewed the Congolese, like other African peoples, as inferior, a perception that the kingdom's rulers exploited to maintain their own control. Slavery, while not new to the Kingdom of Congo, took on a more brutal and expansive form under this alliance. From its earliest days, Congo had used war captives as a source of labor, relocating them to the royal capital to strengthen the monarchy's power. This system of forced relocation became a foundation for Congo's internal governance and, later, its role as a supplier of enslaved people to European traders. While Congolese laws and customs protected freeborn citizens from enslavement, war captives and convicted criminals were vulnerable. Initially, such individuals were used within the kingdom, and the export of female captives was expressly prohibited. Yet, as the kingdom's relationship with Portugal deepened, these restrictions began to erode. By the early 16th century, trade between Congo and Portugal was thriving, primarily in palm cloth, copper, and ivory, but increasingly in slaves. Although Congo was not initially a major exporter of enslaved people, this changed with the rise of the sugar plantations on the Portuguese-controlled island of São Tomé. The island's booming economy demanded a steady supply of labor, and Congo became a key source. Early records, such as the 1502 Cantino Atlas, noted Congo's involvement in this trade, though the numbers were initially small. Over time, however, the trade expanded, fueled by captives taken in war. King Afonso's correspondence provides detailed accounts of this period, including domestic slave markets and the sale of war captives to Portuguese merchants. This trade ultimately tied Congo's fate to the growing Atlantic slave economy, reshaping its society and its place in the world. As the slave trade expanded, it began to undermine the royal authority in the Kingdom of Congo. Portuguese traders, particularly those based in São Tomé, increasingly bypassed the monarchy's control over the trade, instead dealing directly with other African states in the region. This practice not only broke the king's monopoly on the slave trade, but also disrupted the flow of tax revenue to the central government. Adding to this strain, Portuguese merchants and priests living in Congo grew more politically active, often aligning themselves with powerful Congolese nobles, further weakening the monarchy's grip on power. Congo chiefs and their political allies, however, maintained strategic control over the region's vital trade routes. These chiefs occupied key positions along navigable rivers and overland paths, ensuring that European merchants operated under African terms. For instance, in the 1850s, the British trading company Hatton and Cookson negotiated an agreement that allowed them to navigate the Chilongo River, but prohibited travel beyond the village of Tiro, just 8 kilometers inland from the coast. To enforce such restrictions, African leaders established barrages and stationed guards armed with poisoned arrows, ensuring compliance. Similarly, in the early 1870s, German observers noted the presence of toll posts throughout the interior of Mayombe, where caravans were inspected and taxed. Up until the 1880s, European traders conducted most of their business at the coast or along the Congo River's mouth, under conditions dictated primarily by African authorities. However, the 1880s marked a turning point in African-European relations. European powers, seeking to expand their control over Africa, began using deceitful tactics to claim sovereignty over African territories. Many Congo chiefs were tricked into signing treaties that handed over their lands in exchange for meager tributes. This shift culminated after the Berlin Conference of 1885, when European nations formalized their plans to colonize the interior of Africa. These conquests were carried out through violent military campaigns, manu militari, marked by widespread brutality and fierce resistance from local populations. The ultimate goal of the European powers was to seize direct control over Africa's natural resources, labor, and production, drastically altering the socio-political landscape of the Congo and the broader continent. In the 19th century, King Leopold II of Belgium, despite being a constitutional monarch, sought to expand Belgium's influence by colonizing parts of Africa. However, his proposals were repeatedly rejected by the Belgian government. Unwilling to abandon his ambitions, Leopold devised another approach in the 1880s. He used the International African Association, a so-called humanitarian organization he had founded, as a front to execute his plans. While the association presented itself as a charitable effort aimed at bringing civilization to Africa, Leopold's intentions were far from noble. The Congo, with its vast wealth of natural resources, represented a lucrative opportunity for immense profit at minimal cost. Under the guise of philanthropy and humanitarianism, Leopold maneuvered himself into a position of legal ownership over the Congo Kingdom. He renamed the territory the Congo Free State, a misleading title that masked its true nature. Leopold's financial strategy for his new colony was equally self-serving. Instead of relying on Belgian public funds, he exploited the land and people of the Congo to generate the wealth needed to sustain his dominion. The Congolese were forced into unpaid labor, effectively paying for their own enslavement while enriching Leopold, his financial backers, and the Belgian state. The profits extracted from the Congo were used to fund grand projects in Belgium, including landmarks like the Royal Museum of Central Africa. These buildings stand as stark reminders of the exploitation that fueled their creation. But the material gains came at a horrific human cost. The Congo Free State became infamous as one of the bloodiest European colonies in Africa. It wasn't merely a source of unpaid labor, it was the site of brutal oppression and atrocities on a scale that left an indelible scar on the region's history. When Leopold colonized the Congo, he inherited a land brimming with natural wealth and potential. The region held vast deposits of copper, gold, and diamonds, but extracting these resources required significant investment and time before they could generate profits. Eager for quicker returns, Leopold focused on 2 lucrative products, rubber and ivory. Both were in high demand on the global market, but they were labor-intensive and difficult to collect. To overcome this challenge, Leopold resorted to coercion, creating a brutal system of forced labor enforced by the infamous Force Publique, an army made up of both European officers and Congolese conscripts. Leopold's regime was celebrated in Europe for its supposed contributions to eradicating the Arab-led slave trade, building infrastructure in the Congo, and civilizing the population through Christianity. But beneath this veneer of praise lay a much darker reality. The abolition of the Arab slave trade was not driven by a moral imperative, but by Leopold's desire to monopolize the labor force for his own exploitation. Christianity, too, was weaponized. Not to uplift the Congolese, but to make them more submissive to colonial rule. The infrastructure projects, such as hospitals and administrative buildings, were designed to serve the colonizers, with facilities like hospitals being off-limits to the Congolese population. Meanwhile, Congolese communities were burdened with heavy taxes, often paid in kind, at the cost of their health, nutrition, and survival. The demand for rubber and ivory from Europe and beyond was insatiable, and even the massive population of the Congo could not meet the quotas set by Leopold's administration. Rubber, for example, had to be harvested from wild vines deep in the forests, forcing villagers to leave their homes and trek long distances daily. Ivory obtained from hunting elephants was even more challenging to procure. When production levels fell short, the force publique resorted to violence and terror to enforce compliance. The army used brutal methods, including mutilations and mass killings, to intimidate the population and increase output. This reign of terror turned the Congo Free State into one of the most horrifying colonial enterprises in history, leaving a legacy of suffering and loss that would haunt the region for generations. The Congolese villages, already burdened by impossible demands, struggled to meet the high quotas of ivory and rubber imposed by the colonial authorities. When production fell short, even slightly, the force publique responded with harsh measures that deeply affected the local population. Many of the enforcers of these actions were Congolese men, compelled into service or incentivized to obey their European superiors, who represented the interests of imperialist European powers. These soldiers, often taken from their families as children, were raised to serve as laborers or enforcers under the colonial system. Under the orders of their European officers, they carried out extreme punishments that caused great suffering. Among the most feared practices was the severing of hands, feet, or other body parts as a form of punishment for those deemed disobedient. In some instances, these actions were accompanied by disturbing rituals, reflecting the deep cultural and psychological toll of the regime. Physical punishments, such as beatings, were common, and entire villages were destroyed as a warning to others. Beyond this, many Congolese suffered from relentless overwork, which left them physically and emotionally drained. Untreated diseases like smallpox and sleeping sickness swept through communities, claiming countless lives. This devastating system not only caused immense suffering, but also deeply fractured the fabric of Congolese society, leaving lasting wounds that would take generations to heal. The experiences of Congolese women during the colonial era were marked by profound suffering and exploitation. Women were left vulnerable and unprotected, especially when they were unable to meet the demands of state taxes. In such cases, young girls and women were often taken against their will by colonial officials and guards, subjected to harassment, coercion, and exploitation. Forced servitude and mistreatment of women became a harsh and largely unacknowledged reality of the time. This aspect of the colonial atrocities has often been overlooked in historical accounts. While much attention has been given to the mutilation and forced labor endured by Congolese men and communities, the gendered violence that women faced remains one of the least documented and discussed aspects of the era. Sadly, the legacy of this era still lingers, as modern Congo reports alarmingly high rates of violence against women, with roots tracing back to these colonial abuses. The Catholic Church, which played a role in the Congo's colonial economy, also bore witness to the suffering of the people. While some missionaries aligned with colonial interests, others were deeply disturbed by the inhumane practices they observed. These individuals took it upon themselves to document the suffering, capturing photographs of victims, recording testimonies, and writing about the injustices they encountered. Their accounts remain critical historical evidence, shedding light on the atrocities that otherwise might have been forgotten. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, growing international outrage over the atrocities committed in the Congo Free State forced a reckoning for King Leopold II's brutal regime. The abuses had become impossible to ignore as reports from missionaries and travelers began to surface, describing the grim realities faced by the Congolese people. Many of these reports originated from British and Swedish missionaries who bore witness to the exploitation and sought to bring these injustices to light. The first significant call for action came in 1890, when George Washington Williams, an African-American minister, historian, and politician, penned an open letter to King Leopold II. Williams courageously described the horrors he had observed in the Congo, characterizing them as crimes against humanity. This phrase, coined by Williams, would later become a cornerstone of modern international human rights law. His letter and subsequent appeal to the U.S. Secretary of State marked the beginning of organized resistance to Leopold's rule. Public awareness and activism grew significantly after 1895, following high-profile incidents like the Stokes Affair, where a British trader was executed under dubious circumstances, and harrowing accounts of mutilations and other abuses committed by Leopold's agents. These events ignited what became known as the Congo Question, a term that encapsulated the global debate over the ethics and policies of Leopold's governance. To counter the growing criticism, Leopold established the so-called Commission for the Protection of Natives, ostensibly aimed at reforming conditions in the Congo. However, this body, which included foreign missionaries, was little more than a public relations effort and did not lead to meaningful change. The United Kingdom became a focal point for the anti-Leopold movement, spearheaded by the journalist and activist E.D. Morel. A former shipping clerk, Morel had noticed discrepancies in the trade between Belgium and the Congo, particularly the lack of goods returning to the colony, which exposed the exploitative practices fueling the regime. Morel's influential book, Red Rubber, 1906, captured public attention and galvanized the movement. Writers such as Mark Twain, Joseph Conrad, and Arthur Conan Doyle lent their voices to the cause, while Belgian socialists like Emile van der Velde raised awareness within Leopold's own country. The campaign also gained traction in British politics. In May 1903, a debate in the House of Commons culminated in a resolution condemning the Congo Free State. This prompted further investigation, most notably by Roger Casement, the British consul in Boma. Casement undertook an extensive tour of the Congo, gathering first-hand evidence of the systemic abuse. His subsequent Casement report, delivered in December 1903 and revised the following February, provided irrefutable documentation of the atrocities. In a bid to counteract growing British criticism and the international outcry over his brutal regime, Leopold II sought to create the illusion of concern for the Congolese people. Among his strategies was a purported effort to combat diseases such as smallpox and sleeping sickness, which were decimating the population. To lend credibility to this facade, Leopold invited experts from the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine to the Congo to address these health crises. However, the primary goal of these initiatives was not the welfare of the Congolese, but rather to preserve the labor force and deflect criticism from abroad. Free State officials consistently denied that their exploitative policies were responsible for the dramatic population decline in the Congo. Instead, they attributed the losses solely to disease outbreaks, hoping to downplay the systemic violence and forced labor that underpinned Leopold's regime. These justifications did little to satisfy the growing number of international campaigners led by organizations such as the Congo Reform Association, CRA. Notably, the CRA was not opposed to colonialism itself, but sought to curtail the most egregious abuses of Leopold's administration. Their aim was to encourage Belgium to formally annex the Congo, believing this would lead to a more humane system of governance, while maintaining the delicate balance of power in Africa between Britain and France. As Leopold's defenders scrambled to protect his reputation, the regime faced mounting scrutiny. In 1904, a commission of inquiry, established under pressure, but ostensibly by the Free State itself, investigated the allegations of atrocities. To the regime's detriment, the commission confirmed the abuses, including forced labor, systemic violence, and widespread suffering. Its findings added further weight to the campaigns against Leopold, increasing pressure on the Belgian government to intervene. By 1908, the sustained efforts of activists, journalists, and international advocates bore fruit. That year, Belgium formally annexed the Congo, transforming it into the Belgian Congo. The annexation marked the end of Leopold's personal dominion over the territory, as the Free State was dissolved. While the transition from a private colony to a state-administered one brought improvements, it did not entirely erase the legacy of exploitation. Under Belgian control, some of the more overtly abusive practices, such as the unchecked use of forced labor, were partially curtailed. However, many officials who had served under Leopold's Free State retained their positions in the new administration, perpetuating elements of the old system. The Belgian government adopted more indirect methods of labor coercion, such as imposing taxes payable only in cash. This tactic forced Congolese workers to seek employment with European enterprises to earn the money required for these payments. In addition to the tax burden, Congolese communities were still subject to labor requirements. For years after the annexation, they were obligated to contribute a set number of days annually for infrastructure projects, such as building roads and public works. While these obligations were less violent than the outright terror of the Free State era, they continued to place significant strain on the local population. In the late 1950s, the Congo national movement succeeded in bringing down Belgian control, leading to the Congo's independence. However, the effects of violence have remained a persistent issue in the country. After decades of mass killings, terror, exploitation, and the seizure of their land's resources, the Congolese people continue to face challenges rooted in the legacy of European colonization. The impact of King Leopold's reign and subsequent Belgian rule remains immense and unforgettable, even though the history of Congo is often overlooked.